Hi there. If you're here, you're probably looking for two things: a bit of history and a good night's sleep. So lie back, get cozy, maybe dim the lights, maybe pull that blanket up like it's shielding you from royal embarrassment. Tonight, we're heading to the medieval court, but not as a knight, not even as a servant. No, you're the one in the funny hat, the jester, the fool. Sounds fun, right? Until you realize your job is to make a room full of moody nobles laugh, or risk a trip to the dungeon. So close your eyes, quiet your mind, and prepare for a slow, strange descent into the life of the most exhausted entertainer in history. Because being a jester kind of sucked. The illusion of fun. The jester. Court entertainer. Professional fool. In our modern minds, we tend to picture him as a quirky side character. Bells on his head, clever comebacks, maybe juggling a turnip or two for a chuckling king, like a medieval stand-up comic with better posture. But here's the thing, behind the costume, it wasn't all mischief and punchlines. Being a jester wasn't a career you chose. It was one that happened to you, like food poisoning, or being left-handed in a world built for swords. Most jesters didn't train at some royal comedy academy. There were no open mic nights at the tavern. You didn't dream of cracking jokes for someone who could legally execute you for a bad one. You were chosen, usually because you stood out, and not in the good way. Maybe you were unusually small, or unusually tall. Maybe you had a limp or a strange voice, or were just odd in a way that amused someone important. They'd point and say, "That one. He's funny." And just like that, congratulations. You're the entertainment now. Sometimes it was accidental. You slipped in the mud at a feast, or mimicked a noble behind their back and got caught, and instead of punishment, you got promoted to court jester. Other times you were bought, literally, collected like a rare pet or a fancy goblet, carted from one noble court to another as a gift. Imagine being wrapped in sarcasm and tied with a bell. But here's the cruel joke. You didn't get to leave, not without consequences. Because once you were labeled the fool, you didn't just have a job. You became a walking mood regulator for powerful people with very fragile egos. And your job? To be hilarious, constantly, even when you were tired, even when you were sick. Even when the kingdom was burning and your tooth was aching and the queen's cousin had just died from gout. No one cared. Make them laugh, fool. That's why you're here. The origins of fools. Let's rewind a bit. The whole concept of keeping a professional idiot around isn't exactly new. The ancient Egyptians had court dwarfs as early as 2500 BCE. Not exactly jesters yet, but definitely the spiritual ancestors of court entertainment. They were kept around to amuse pharaohs who, apparently, got bored easily despite being living gods with unlimited power and wealth. Go figure. The Romans had their own version too. They called them moriones. These weren't just any fools, but specifically people with developmental disabilities who were kept around for entertainment. Yes, it's exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds. Roman aristocrats would literally collect people with disabilities to laugh at during dinner parties. Next time someone tells you about the glory of Rome, maybe mention that charming little tradition. In China, court jesters date back to the Zhou dynasty around 1046-256 BCE. One famous jester named Yu Se actually saved thousands of lives by convincing Emperor Qin Shi Huang not to paint the Great Wall. The emperor had wanted to paint the entire 500-mile structure. Yu Se made a joke so clever about this ridiculous idea that the emperor backed down. Imagine saving lives with a well-timed punchline. That's pressure even modern comedians don't face. By the time we reach medieval Europe, the era we usually picture when thinking about jesters, the tradition was already ancient. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval jesters didn't just appear out of thin air wearing those silly hats with bells. They evolved from various traditions, including the old Roman mimes, wandering minstrels, and local village idiots who somehow got promotions. The fashion statement. Nobody asked for. Let's talk about that outfit for a minute. You know the one, the motley clothes, the funny hat with bells, the scepter with a face on it called a marotte. This wasn't some fashion week inspiration. This was your uniform of humiliation. The multicolored, patched-together clothing, called motley, wasn't just a fashion choice. It symbolized that you were outside normal society. You literally wore your outsider status. The bright colors and patterns were meant to be jarring and ridiculous, like a walking billboard that screamed, "Don't take me seriously." And those bells weren't just cute accessories. They announced your presence everywhere you went. No sneaking around for the court jester. No private moments. Those bells were basically medieval ankle monitors, letting everyone know where the fool was at all times. The hat with those ridiculous donkey ears? That was called a coxcomb, designed to mimic a rooster's crest. Because nothing says dignity like being dressed as poultry. Many jesters were forced to carry that stick with a miniature version of their own face on it, the marotte. Essentially, you had to carry around a tiny puppet of yourself to talk to. It was like being forced to do a ventriloquist act with yourself as the dummy. Will Sommers, Henry VIII's famous jester, apparently had some say in his wardrobe and opted for more subdued colors. But he was the exception, not the rule. Most jesters wore what they were told to wear, no matter how uncomfortable or humiliating. A day in the life less fun than you'd think? So what did the average Tuesday look like if you were, say, a 14th century court jester? Wake up, probably in some small chamber near the royal quarters because you needed to be available at all times. Get dressed in your ridiculous outfit and report for duty. Your workday didn't have set hours. You were on call basically whenever the monarch or noble was awake. Bored at breakfast? Call the jester. Can't sleep at 2 a.m.? Wake up the jester. Having a tense political meeting that could use some lightening up? Jester time. Your job description was vague at best. Yes, you needed to be funny, but that wasn't all. You might also be expected to sing songs, whether or not you could actually sing, play musical instruments, training optional, perform acrobatics, hope you're flexible, tell stories, better be good at improvising, juggle, don't drop anything valuable, dance, coordination recommended but not required, mimic important people but only when told to, deliver news too uncomfortable for others to say, remember every detail about everyone at court, act as a living memory bank of court gossip and history. That last point is actually important. In a world before Google, jesters often served as informal historians. They remembered who was feuding with whom, which noble had embarrassed themselves at the last feast, which treaties were signed when, all while pretending to be too foolish to understand the significance of what they knew. Meals were an especially important performance time. As courts dined, jesters would circulate, cracking jokes, telling stories, maybe doing some impromptu acrobatics between the soup and the main course. Hope you didn't actually want to eat while the food was hot. Jesters ate the leftovers from the high table, sitting with servants after their performance duties were done. Some accounts suggest they sometimes ate scraps right from the floor, like dogs, for laughs. Hilarious, right? And don't forget you were still performing while eating. Every joke you made, every story you told outside of formal performances was carefully noted. Say something too clever, and you might be accused of not being enough of a fool. Say something too foolish, and well, you weren't doing your job well. The thin line between comedy and death. Here's where being a jester gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean terrifying. You were one of the few people allowed to criticize the ruler. In fact, it was part of your job description. Sounds progressive, right? Well, not exactly. You could deliver uncomfortable truths disguised as jokes. Medieval rulers actually valued this to a point. The jester could say what counselors and advisors couldn't. They could point out flaws in plans, highlight unpopular decisions, even mock the ruler's appearance or behavior. But there was a catch. You had to be funny while doing it, and you had to judge the mood perfectly, and you could never, ever cross that invisible line that existed in the monarch's mind between amusing criticism and off with his head. Take John Pace, a jester to Queen Elizabeth I. Once, when she was in a particularly bad mood, she apparently told him to get out after one of his jokes. He took it literally and fled court entirely, hiding until her anger cooled. Smart man. Jane Fool, a female jester also in Elizabeth's court, once hid the Queen's favorite ring as a prank. Elizabeth was so upset she ordered a full search of the palace. When Jane revealed she had it all along, Elizabeth laughed. But it could have gone very differently. Archibald Armstrong, jester to King James I of England, pressed his luck too far. After mocking Archbishop Laud one too many times, he was dismissed from court in 1637. He was lucky. Dismissal was preferable to what happened to many jesters who misjudged their audience. And that's just England, which was relatively civilized about these things. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible once had a jester dressed up as the Tsar for a joke, sat him on the throne, crowned him, and then had him executed for impersonating the ruler. The punchline was murder, not exactly a knee-slapper. The surprising power of the powerless. Despite all this, jesters sometimes wielded real influence. They had the ear of the most powerful person in the realm after all. They saw rulers at their most relaxed, their most vulnerable, their most human. Triboulet, jester to King Francis I of France, once slapped the king on the bottom. When Francis threatened to execute him, Triboulet replied that he deserved a noble death and should be beheaded. The king, amused by this clever response, agreed to pardon him to a more humiliating death. Then Triboulet countered that he should be given 10 years to prepare for death, knowing the king would eventually forget the whole thing. And it worked. He wasn't executed at all. Some jesters became trusted advisors, using humor to guide their patrons toward better decisions. William Somer, or Somers, Henry VIII's jester, was one of the few people who could calm the notoriously volatile king during his rages. When Henry was in one of his dangerous moods, courtiers would sometimes send Somer in first as a human mood detector. If the jester came out alive and laughing, it was probably safe to approach the king. In medieval Japan, a similar tradition existed with advisors called taikobo, who used self-deprecating humor to deliver uncomfortable truths to shoguns and emperors. One famous taikobo named Sorori Shinzaemon once pointed out the shogun's excessive spending by presenting him with an absurdly tiny meal, claiming he could no longer afford proper portions due to taxation. Not all bells and whistles. There's a misconception that all jesters were these jolly, carefree spirits who danced through life without a care. Reality was much darker. Many jesters developed what we'd now recognize as coping mechanisms for their bizarre social position. They lived constantly suspended between privilege and punishment, close to power but completely powerless themselves. They needed to be smart enough to craft clever jokes but appear stupid enough not to be threatening. Some turned to alcohol to manage the stress. Richard Tarleton, Elizabeth I's favorite jester, was notorious for his drinking. Others developed elaborate personas that allowed them to separate their performance self from their true identity, an early form of compartmentalization. Depression seems to have been common. Records show several jesters who, despite their comical public persona, were described as melancholic or withdrawn when not performing. Some medieval medical texts even suggested that jesters needed to be watched for signs of the black humor, melancholia, overtaking them. Physical disabilities that made someone a suitable jester often caused pain or difficulty that was ignored or even mocked. Geoffrey Hudson, the court dwarf of Queen Henrietta Maria, wife of Charles I of England, suffered from a condition that likely caused joint pain and other health issues. No sick days for Geoffrey, though. Being small was literally his job. The end of an era. As courts became more formal and structured in the late Renaissance and early modern period, the role of the jester began to fade. By the mid-17th century, professional court jesters were increasingly rare in Western Europe. The last officially recognized court jester in England was Muckle John, who served Charles I until the English Civil War. After Charles was executed in 1649, Muckle John disappeared from the historical record. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, Charles II didn't appoint a new jester. The position had become outdated, replaced by more refined entertainments like theater companies and musical performances. In France, the tradition lasted a bit longer. Louis XIV had several fools in the early part of his reign, but by the time he established Versailles as his permanent court, the position had been formalized out of existence. In Russia, Peter the Great kept several jesters well into the 18th century. He even forced members of his court who had displeased him to serve as jesters as punishment. Imagine being demoted from nobleman to professional fool, in many ways worse than outright dismissal. When the last true court jesters faded away, they were replaced by professional entertainers, actors, musicians, dancers who performed at court but weren't bound to it, people who could leave after the show was over, people who could have bad days without risking execution. The modern echoes. Today we still have our jesters of sorts, late-night comedians who poke fun at politicians, satirists who point out uncomfortable truths through humor. The difference is consent and choice. Modern comedians choose their profession and can quit if it becomes too much. Stand-up comedians sometimes talk about bombing on stage as their worst nightmare. Medieval jesters knew that bombing could be literal. Their worst nightmare wasn't awkward silence, it was the executioner's block. So next time you see those cheerful jesters at Renaissance fairs, jingling their bells and cracking jokes, remember what you're really looking at. The sanitized, family-friendly version of what was originally a pretty dark institution. The bells may have jingled, but they were shackles all the same. The jokes may have made others laugh, but they were often born from real pain. The colorful clothes marked someone who didn't fit in, who existed outside the normal rules and protections of society. Behind every "hey nani nani" was a person trapped in a role they likely didn't choose, walking a tightrope over disaster, trying to survive the only way available to them, by making the powerful laugh. In the end, perhaps the greatest illusion wasn't the jester's magic tricks or acrobatics or clever wordplay. It was the illusion that any of it was truly fun for the one wearing the bells. A day in the life of someone who can't afford a bad joke. You wake up in the corner of the castle, somewhere between the kitchens and the broom closet. It's cold. The floor is stone. Your bed is technically a sack, though it's unclear what was supposed to be inside of it. You roll over and something squeaks. Maybe a rat. Maybe your back. Before you can even stretch, there's a knock at the door, or maybe just a loud grunt from a kitchen boy. The king's in a mood. Again. You're needed. Again. You throw on your clothes, if you can call them that. A patchwork tunic in colors no sane person would combine. Bells on your shoes. Bells on your hat. Bells on your belt. Apparently, no one in this castle wants to be surprised by your presence. You walk through the great hall like a living wind chime, dodging servants, eye rolls, and that one noble who still thinks it's funny to yank your sleeve and say, "Dance, fool." You don't respond. You smile. You always smile. Breakfast isn't really a meal for you. It's leftovers, whatever the nobles didn't finish. Maybe a cold piece of bread. Maybe a boiled turnip if you're lucky. You eat it standing up because jesters don't sit unless someone tells them to. And no one's telling you anything today. Mid-morning is for appearances. You drift around the court like an awkward shadow with bells, always alert. If you see the queen, you curtsy. If you see the duke, you smirk. If someone important sighs too loudly, you're expected to pop up and make it better. You're not on a stage. You are the stage. Every hallway is a performance. Every silence is a test. Even your walk has to be entertaining. Not too proud, not too sad. Just whimsical enough to be harmless. By midday, you've already recited a limerick, mimicked 2 bishops, and pretended to trip on a goose. You're sweating. The nobles are mildly amused. The king laughs once. That laugh might keep you employed for another week. You get no break. You get no privacy. You are, quite literally, court property, like a chandelier with opinions. When the feast begins in the evening, you're not dining. You're orbiting, floating from table to table, performing on demand. Someone shouts your name mid-toast. Tell a joke. Someone tosses a chicken bone at your feet. Do a trick. Someone's wife is laughing a little too hard at you. Time to change the subject. You never know when the mood will turn. One wrong word, one off-color comment, and the same people who cheered your performance an hour ago are staring at you like you farted during Mass. And if the king's not laughing, then no one is. And that's your fault. So you keep going, past the jokes, past the fatigue, past the moment you realize you're not really a person to them anymore. You're a noise, a distraction, a safety valve in a room where everyone's pretending they're not terrified of each other. You perform until the candles burn low and the nobles stagger off to their rooms. And then, only then, you're allowed to go back to your sack of a bed, unpeel your ridiculous costume, and rest your sore, silent smile. If you're lucky, you fall asleep fast. If you're not, you lie awake, listening to the echoes of laughter, wondering how much of it was really for you, and how much of it was just about having someone else to laugh at. Before the bell rings, let's back up a little and talk about your living arrangements. That corner of the castle isn't exactly prime real estate. Medieval castle architecture wasn't big on privacy or comfort for servants, and jesters ranked somewhere between valued servant and talking furniture. So where did you actually sleep? If you're a lower-ranking jester in a modest, noble household, you might literally bed down in the great hall alongside other servants. Imagine trying to get some sleep while kitchen boys and scullery maids step over you at dawn. Medieval great halls were the multi-purpose rooms of their day. Dining room by day, dormitory by night. The floors would be strewn with rushes, dried grasses and herbs that were supposedly changed regularly, but, let's be honest, probably weren't. Those rushes held everything from food scraps to flea eggs to the occasional mouse family. Your bedding? A straw-filled mattress if you're lucky, or just your cloak if you're not. In a royal court, you might rate slightly better accommodations, what medieval people called a truckle bed in an anteroom of some important person's chamber. This glorified pallet would roll under a larger bed during the day and be pulled out at night. Why keep the jester so close? Because entertainment might be required at any hour. Insomnia was common among the wealthy and powerful, especially in an age before electric lights regulated sleep cycles. If the king woke at 3 a.m., guess who might get kicked awake to tell a story or sing a song? Some court records from the late medieval period actually mention specific chambers for jesters, usually small rooms near the kitchens for easy access to leftover food, or near the royal apartments for easy access to, well, you. These weren't exactly luxury suites. Often, They were repurposed storage spaces with just enough room for a bed and perhaps a small chest for your few possessions. Speaking of possessions, what exactly did a medieval jester own? Not much. Your costume, certainly, though technically even that often belonged to your master. Perhaps a musical instrument if you were that kind of entertainer, a lute, a small drum or pipes, maybe a marotte, that strange scepter with your own face on it. A few personal trinkets, perhaps a small knife for eating. That's about it. The wealthier the court, the better your chances of decent accommodations. At the royal courts of France and England, some favored jesters were granted actual chambers with windows and fireplaces. But those were the A-list jesters, the medieval equivalent of having your name above the title on a movie poster. Most made do with whatever corner they were assigned. Morning rituals and unwritten rules. Your morning routine isn't exactly a spa experience. There's no hot shower, no coffee, not even a proper bathroom. Nature calls. Chamber pots are your friend, or the castle garderobe if you're feeling fancy. A garderobe, by the way, was essentially a medieval toilet. A hole in a stone seat that dropped waste directly down the castle wall into a pit or moat below. Charming. Personal hygiene is limited. You might splash some water on your face from a basin, if you're important enough to have one, or head to the kitchen to beg for warm water. Teeth cleaning? A cloth rubbed with salt, or if you're fancy, some powder made from crushed herbs. Deodorant? That's what those strongly scented herbs in your costume are partly for. Mixing with your inevitable body odor to create something marginally less offensive. Getting dressed is a process, especially if you have one of those elaborate jester costumes. The multicolored motley isn't just thrown together. Each patch is sewn carefully to create that haphazard look. The bells must be securely fastened. Nothing worse than losing a bell during a performance and having the king's dog swallow it. Yes, that really happened to one unfortunate jester. If you're a royal court jester, you might have help dressing, not because you're important, but because your appearance reflects on the court. Your costume is a status symbol for your master as much as it is your uniform of humiliation. The more elaborate your outfit, the wealthier and more prestigious your patron appears. As you prepare for the day, you're also mentally preparing your material. This isn't just about remembering jokes, it's strategic. You need to know who's visiting court today, what political tensions are simmering, which courtiers are feuding, who's fallen in or out of favor. You gather this intelligence through the servant network. Kitchen gossip is worth its weight in gold. You also need to gauge the mood of your patron before you even see them. Is the king nursing a hangover from last night's feast? Did the queen receive bad news from a foreign ally? Did that diplomatic visit go poorly? Your approach will need to be calibrated accordingly. Too boisterous on a somber day could cost you. Too subdued when celebration is expected is equally dangerous. The unwritten rules of jester conduct are numerous and contradictory. Be funny, but not too clever. Be noticeable, but know when to disappear. Mock courtiers, but never too harshly unless the monarch clearly approves. Know everyone's name, but pretend to forget them for comic effect. Remember every detail of court politics, but appear oblivious. It's exhausting before you've even started your day. The art of calculated humiliation. By mid-morning, you're fully in character. Let's talk about what that actually means. Your walk isn't your own anymore. Medieval jesters often adopted exaggerated gaits, a skip, a hop, a strange shuffling motion. These weren't just random choices, but calculated performances designed to remind everyone of your full status without being truly disruptive. Court records describe some jesters as prancing like deer or hopping like birds. Deliberate movements that marked them as separate from the dignified gliding of nobles. Your voice changes too. Many jesters adopted distinct speech patterns, higher pitched, or with an exaggerated regional accent, or peppered with nonsense words and animal sounds. Whatever makes you memorable but not threatening. Some jesters even developed entire nonsense languages that sounded amusing, but actually contained coded observations about court life that would have been dangerous to state plainly. Remember that limerick you recited? It wasn't just any limerick. It was carefully crafted to amuse without offending, unless offense was strategically directed. Medieval court humor was surprisingly bawdy by our standards. Sexual jokes, scatological humor, and mockery of physical attributes were all fair game. But political humor? That had to be handled with extreme care. When you mimicked those two bishops, you didn't just copy their voices. You studied their mannerisms for weeks. How one tugs at his beard when nervous, how the other rocks slightly on his heels when trying to make a point. Your imitation is so accurate that everyone knows exactly who you're portraying without you having to name names. It's a skill that took years to develop. That fake trip over a goose? Pure physical comedy but with precise timing. You made it look spontaneous, but you planned it carefully, making sure you were in the king's line of sight, ensuring you wouldn't actually break anything valuable, calculating your fall to look painful without actually hurting yourself too badly. Medieval jesters were early stunt performers, taking physical risks for laughs. Bruises and small injuries were just part of the job. Records show that jesters often suffered physical ailments related to their performances, twisted ankles from pratfalls, hoarse voices from constant talking and singing, repetitive stress injuries from juggling or acrobatics. Medical care for these issues? Minimal at best. Rub some herbal poultice on it and get back to being funny. The psychological toll was arguably worse. You're not just performing, you're performing a debased version of yourself. Every laugh comes at your expense in some way. You're crafting your own humiliation as an art form, finding ever more creative ways to be the butt of the joke before someone else makes you one in a way you can't control. Laughter as currency. By midday, you've earned exactly one royal laugh. Let's consider the economics of that laugh. In the medieval court, laughter was literally currency for a jester. Each genuine chuckle from the monarch was a deposit in your job security account. Each time you failed to amuse was a withdrawal. If your balance hit zero, you were done, possibly in more ways than one. Historical records show that jesters were compensated in wildly inconsistent ways. Some received regular stipends, actual coins, or goods. Others were paid primarily in leftovers, cast-off clothing, and basic shelter. The most successful might receive land grants or special privileges, but these could be revoked at any moment if favor was lost. Will Somers, Henry VIII's famous jester, received £4 per year in wages around 1551. A decent sum for the time, but hardly lavish for someone constantly in the royal presence. Triboulet, jester to Francis V of France, received regular payments in livres and occasional gifts of clothing. But for every well-documented royal jester, dozens of lesser court fools survived on whatever scraps of food and attention came their way. Your value was entirely subjective, based on the whims of your patron. There was no medieval Yelp where jesters could be rated. No fool's guild to establish minimum wages or working conditions. Your worth was measured laugh by laugh, day by day, and performing on demand meant exactly that. Historical accounts describe jesters being woken in the middle of the night to entertain drunk nobles, being ordered to jump into freezing castle moats as a prank, being forced to eat inedible items for the amusement of court. Refusing wasn't an option if you wanted to maintain your position or sometimes your life. Records from medieval courts contain numerous accounts of jesters being punished for failed comedy. Everything from being denied food to public beatings to more creative humiliations. In 1463, according to court records, One unfortunate jester at a minor German court was forced to spend a winter night in the castle's dovecote pigeon house after failing to amuse a visiting dignitary. He survived but suffered frostbite in several toes. The idea that the king's not laughing could spell professional doom wasn't just a figure of speech. When Charles then of England was captured during the English Civil War, his jester, the wonderfully named Muckle John, was dismissed from service. With no royal laughter to sustain him, Muckle John disappears from the historical record, likely dying in poverty, his skills unmarketable in Puritan-controlled England. The feast, center stage, and invisible evening feasts were a jester's prime time, your biggest audience, highest stakes, and most demanding performance hours. Medieval feasts weren't just meals. They were elaborate social performances where food was almost secondary to the display of wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. These events could last 4 to 6 hours, with multiple courses, entertainment between servings, and complex social rituals throughout. And you, the jester, were expected to help manage the entire emotional atmosphere of the room. Your duties during a feast went far beyond telling jokes. You were part master of ceremonies, part social lubricant, part tension diffuser, and part human sacrifice to the gods of awkwardness. When two nobles who hated each other were seated too close, your job to distract them with a story before wine and daggers started flying. When a visiting diplomat was clearly bored, your responsibility to engage them without seeming too familiar. When the third course was delayed because the kitchen set something on fire, your problem to solve by filling time with an impromptu song. You didn't eat during the main feast, not properly anyway. Historical accounts suggest jesters often grabbed bites between performances, sometimes being tossed morsels like dogs. If you were lucky, you might be allowed to sit and eat properly after the main courses, when nobles were moving on to drinking and less formal entertainment. The tosses of food mentioned in the original text, those chicken bones landing at your feet, weren't just literary flourish. This actually happened. Medieval dining was far less prissy about food disposal. Bones, gristle, and other inedible bits were commonly tossed on the floor. Hence those rushes mentioned earlier. They weren't just decorative but practical, absorbing spills and disguising food waste. Having food thrown in your direction wasn't necessarily an insult. It could be a bizarre form of approval, a reward for amusing the thrower. Your physical position during feasts was symbolic of your social position, neither fully present nor fully excluded. You didn't sit at table, you circulated. You existed in the social margins, allowed to speak when others would be silenced for interrupting, yet never truly participating in the event. You were simultaneously the center of attention and invisible as a person. Records from medieval courts describe how jesters would sometimes eat from special plates or cups designed to mock them. Bowls with two bottoms that would spill when used incorrectly. Cups with hidden holes that would drip wine on their costumes. These joke implements were actually crafted by skilled artisans specifically to humiliate the court fool during feasts. The strange moment mentioned where someone's wife is laughing a little too hard at you, that points to another complex aspect of jester life. You were one of the few males at court who could safely interact with noble women without raising eyebrows. You weren't seen as a real man in the sexual sense, more like a living toy or pet. This could put you in awkward positions, navigating the attention of bored or flirtatious noble ladies without offending their husbands. The dangerous hours. As evening wore on and the wine flowed freely, your job became increasingly hazardous. Drunk nobles were unpredictable nobles, and unpredictable nobles were dangerous to everyone, especially you. This was when the mood could turn most treacherously. Medieval feasts often devolved into what we might charitably call rowdy, as the night progressed. Wine was consumed in quantities that would alarm modern doctors. Food was rich and heavy. Emotions that had been suppressed during the formal parts of the evening began to surface. Historical accounts describe feasts ending in everything from impromptu wrestling matches to full-blown sword fights. In 1425, during a Christmas feast at the court of Charles VII of France, two nobles reportedly dueled over who could better mimic the court jester, the jester in question having to stand by and watch his mannerisms being mocked by the very people who expected him to amuse them. As the designated entertainer, you were expected to navigate these increasingly choppy social waters. Make the wrong joke when a noble is in his cups. You might find yourself on the receiving end of anything from verbal abuse to physical assault. Court records contain numerous accounts of jesters being struck, shoved, or having food and drink thrown at them when alcohol-lowered inhibitions met fragile noble egos. That comment about farting during Mass hits historical accuracy right on the nose. Medieval and Renaissance courts operated with complex, almost ritualistic codes of behavior. Violating these social codes, even accidentally, could result in immediate ostracism. And nothing violated social codes faster than ill-timed humor about the wrong subject. Certain topics were perpetually dangerous ground. The king's personal relationships, genuine religious controversies, and ongoing negotiations with other kingdoms topped the list. Other subjects might become temporarily hazardous due to current events. If the kingdom had just lost a battle to France, French jokes were off the menu. If the queen had recently miscarried, anything touching on children or fertility was forbidden territory. Navigation became especially treacherous when courts were divided into factions, which they almost always were. Laugh too hard at a joke made by the leader of one court faction, and you've just offended the rival faction. Seem too familiar with a particular noble, and you might be suspected of carrying their messages or spying for them. And always, there was the awareness that your status offered minimal protection. When nobles got drunk enough, the very notion that a lowly jester was off limits for serious abuse could easily be forgotten. The silent hours, when the feast finally ended and the nobles staggered off to their chambers, your day wasn't necessarily over. This is when the performance until the candles burn low part comes in. For one thing, you might be commanded to continue entertaining in a more intimate setting. Historical records mention jesters being summoned to private chambers to tell bedtime stories, sing lullabies, or simply provide background entertainment while nobles prepared for sleep. King Philip IV of Spain reportedly could not fall asleep without his favorite dwarf jester, Sebastian de Mora, telling him stories from a special stool placed near the royal bed. Even if not formally performing, these late hours often involved important work intelligence gathering. As the court fool, you were one of the few people who could move between different social spheres. You heard the kitchen gossip, the guards' complaints, the ladies' whispers, and the lord's drunken boasts. This information was valuable currency, helping you craft more effective humor, and occasionally helping you avoid dangerous situations. Late night was also when you might find brief moments of camaraderie with other court outsiders, musicians, other entertainers, certain servants. Historical accounts suggest jesters often formed bonds with court dwarfs, musicians, and foreigners, all people who, like themselves, existed in the social margins of court life. When you finally do reach your sleeping quarters, that process of unpeeling your ridiculous costume wasn't quick or simple. Those bells had to be carefully removed so they wouldn't wake anyone. The elaborate motley had to be hung properly to avoid wrinkles. You couldn't just toss it in the corner unless you wanted a beating from the master of wardrobe in the morning. Your face paint, if you wore it, some jesters did, had to be removed with oil or animal fat. Your props had to be stored safely. Any injuries or bruises from the day's physical comedy had to be tended as best you could manage. The thoughts before sleep, those final moments before sleep, when you lie awake, listening to the echoes of laughter, represent perhaps the most human aspect of jester existence, the inevitable reflection on your strange social position. Medieval writings about court fools often touch on this philosophical dimension. In Sebastian Brant's Ship of Fools, 1494, he notes that the fool knows he wears the motley, suggesting self-awareness of their performance and status. Shakespeare, who wrote perhaps the most complex jester characters in literature, consistently gives his fools moments of profound insight and self-reflection. There's historical evidence that some real jesters struggled with exactly this existential question. How much of the laughter was with them versus at them? Roland the Farter, yes, that was his actual professional name, court jester to Henry II of England, was granted 30 acres of land and a manor in Suffolk in return for his annual Christmas performance of one jump, one whistle, and one fart before the king. Records suggest he eventually tried to distance himself from his performance persona, using the more dignified name Roland le Pétour in legal documents. The psychological toll of constant performance is documented in several medieval accounts. Chicot, jester to Henry III and Henry IV of France, was described as melancholic when not performing, and would reportedly sit in silence for hours when not required to entertain. Will Sommers was noted to often retire early from feasts when given permission, preferring solitude to continued socialization. This question of authentic connection, whether people are laughing with you or at you, wasn't just philosophical for medieval jesters. It had practical implications. A jester who was genuinely liked might be protected during court upheavals, warned of dangers, or even granted retirement with provisions. One who was merely tolerated as an object of ridicule could be discarded without thought when no longer amusing. As you drift off to sleep, these questions hover unresolved. Tomorrow you'll wake up and do it all again. Walk the narrow path between amusing and offensive, between valued and expendable, between person and prop. The bed may be uncomfortable, the room may be cold, but at least in sleep, no one expects you to smile. The joke that could kill you. Here's something they don't tell you when they hand you the hat with the bells. Being a jester was less about comedy and more about caution, because in the medieval court, humor wasn't harmless. It was dangerous. Every joke had teeth. Every pun had politics. And you were expected to tiptoe along that razor-thin line between witty and whipped. You see, a noble could say almost anything and be praised for their charm. But you were the fool, which meant your words weren't yours. They were a tool, a sword made of sarcasm, and you had to wield it blindfolded. One day you joke about the Duke's bald spot. The court laughs. The next day, the Duke's in a mood, and now you're mocking the divine image, and someone's sharpening an axe behind the stables. Timing was everything, tone even more so. And the room? Oh, the room always shifted. You had to read it faster than you could blink. Who's laughing too loud? Who's not laughing at all? Who just got insulted in Latin by someone across the table and might take it out on you? Because you were the safest target. The jester was both protected and exposed, allowed to mock but not too much, allowed to speak truth, but only if wrapped in a riddle and served with a backflip. Too direct? You're insolent. Too vague? You're boring. Too clever? You're a threat. Too dull? You're replaceable. And make no mistake, there was no HR department, no second chances. No, sorry, the vibe was off tonight. If you insulted the wrong cousin or made a bishop feel insecure about his nose, your career might end with a formal dismissal or an informal beheading. Because here's the thing, you were never untouchable. You were tolerated. Like an amusing rash, some jesters survived by mastering the art of absurdity. They spoke in riddles, used animal metaphors. The rooster who crows too early may find himself in the stew. Everyone chuckles. The king nods. No one's entirely sure who it was about, and that's exactly the point. It was comedy as camouflage. You weren't just being funny, you were being careful. Because sometimes the sharpest truth in the room came with bells on its hat, and everyone knew it, which made you a little terrifying and very, very alone. The medieval power structure, your comic minefield. To understand just how precarious a jester's position was, you need to understand the medieval world. Imagine a pyramid made of glass daggers. At the top sits the monarch, allegedly appointed by God himself. Directly below, like sharks circling a particularly divine piece of chum, are the high nobility dukes, earls, counts, and their various subcategories of important people with impressive hats. The medieval hierarchy wasn't just about who got the comfier chair. It was a rigid social structure considered divinely ordained. The great chain of being, they called it, a concept that organized everything from angels to animals in a fixed, unchangeable order. Kings were just below angels, peasants just above plants, and everyone had their immovable place. Questioning this arrangement wasn't just rude, it was heresy, blasphemy. The medieval equivalent of suggesting gravity was optional. Let's put this in perspective. In 1381, during the English Peasants' Revolt, the rebel leader Wat Tyler dared to suggest commoners might deserve basic rights. He was stabbed to death during negotiations, his head displayed on London Bridge, and that was considered a perfectly reasonable response to someone getting uppity. Now, into this delightful arrangement insert you, the jester. Your entire job revolves around making jokes about this sacred system while somehow not ending up like Wat Tyler. Good luck. Court life operated on elaborate, almost theatrical rules. Precedents? Who sits where? Who enters a room first? Who speaks when? Wasn't just etiquette. It was the visible expression of this divine order. A duke expected to be seated closer to the monarch than a baron. A royal cousin expected deference from a mere court official. The Bishop of Winchester would throw an ecclesiastical fit if seated below the Bishop of Durham. Unless at a northern province event, yes, they actually had rules that specific. As court jester, you had the dubious privilege of being outside this rigid system while simultaneously being trapped within it. You didn't have a defined rank, which occasionally protected you but more often left you vulnerable to everyone. You could sit on the floor near the king, a shocking liberty, but could be kicked by a minor baron without consequence. And politics? Medieval courts were less centers of government and more vipers' nests with fancy tapestries. Political factions formed and dissolved around family connections, regional interests, religious differences, and good old-fashioned greed. The Wars of the Roses, which ripped England apart for decades, began essentially as a family squabble that got out of hand. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France left thousands dead over what was fundamentally a disagreement about which version of Christianity was correct. Your jokes navigated this lethal labyrinth of allegiances, feuds, and religious sensitivities. Make a quip about red roses when the white rose faction is ascendant? Hope you didn't have plans for your head staying attached to your neck. The monarch. Your protector and potential executioner. The relationship between jester and monarch deserves special attention because it was uniquely complex. The king or queen was simultaneously your greatest protection and your most dangerous audience. Medieval monarchs wielded power in ways modern people can barely comprehend. The concept of divine right meant kings answered to God alone, not parliaments, not public opinion, certainly not legal codes. When Louis XIV of France allegedly declared "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, he wasn't being poetic. He literally embodied the entire French government in his royal person. This meant a monarch's favor could lift you from nothing to nobility with a word. Their disfavor could send you from palace to prison between heartbeats. There was no appeal, no judicial review, no constitutional protection, just the royal will, as changeable as the weather and often just as destructive when it turned. As a jester, you belonged to the monarch in a direct, almost intimate way. You were a royal possession, part pet, part toy, part mirror. This created a strange bond that sometimes protected jesters from the worst consequences of their barbed humor. Consider Archibald Armstrong, court jester to James I of England. He once called Archbishop Laud, one of the most powerful men in England, the great and fat fool. When Laud complained, King James allegedly responded, "What would you have me do with him? Hang him. One fool cannot hang another." But this protection only existed while royal favor remained. When Armstrong finally overstepped by mocking the same archbishop once too often under James's successor Charles I, he was dismissed from court in 1637, lucky to escape with just the loss of his position. The monarch's mood dictated your safety margin. Historical records show how dramatically this could shift. Henry VIII, famously volatile even before a jousting accident further affected his temperament, could go from roaring with laughter to murderous rage within moments. His jester, Will Somers, developed an almost supernatural ability to read the king's moods, knowing exactly when to push and when to retreat. When Louis XIII of France fell into one of his frequent melancholic states, his jester L'Angely needed to measure every syllable, knowing a misstep when the king was feeling dark could be fatal. By contrast, when Louis was feeling well, L'Angely could get away with remarkably pointed jokes about court corruption. Even Elizabeth I, generally considered more stable than many of her royal contemporaries, once threatened to have her jester's head removed for a poorly timed jest about her reluctance to marry. The jester in question, Pace, fled court entirely and hid until her anger cooled. The monarchy wasn't just another job with a temperamental boss. It was placing your life in the hands of someone who could execute you on a whim, to amuse yourself by making that same person laugh. It required nerves of steel wrapped in the appearance of bumbling frivolity. The church, Divine Comedy's dangerous audience. If navigating royal moods wasn't challenging enough, the medieval jester also had to contend with an even more powerful and touchy institution, the church. Medieval Christianity wasn't just a Sunday commitment. It permeated every aspect of society. The church controlled education, regulated marriages, influenced economics through its prohibition of usury, charging interest, and operated its own courts with jurisdiction over a wide range of offenses. Bishops weren't just religious figures. They were political powerhouses with armies and territories, making jokes about religion, about as safe as juggling nitroglycerin, barefoot. During an earthquake, heresy wasn't just frowned upon, it was a capital offense. During the medieval Inquisition, which began in the 12th century, merely questioning church doctrine could lead to imprisonment, torture, or execution. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, took this to new extremes, creating an atmosphere where religious conformity was enforced through institutionalized terror. So when that bishop with the prominent nose took offense at your subtle implication that he resembled a particularly sanctimonious toucan, he didn't just have hurt feelings. He had the power to have you investigated for heresy, a process that made modern tax audits look like spa treatments. Jesters had to be particularly careful with religious humor because the line between acceptable comedy and punishable blasphemy was thin and constantly shifting. A joke about a corrupt priest might be tolerated, especially if the monarch was having issues with the church at that moment. A jest that seemed to mock a sacrament or article of faith could land you in serious trouble. There's historical evidence that some jesters navigated this by developing specific types of religious humor that mocked human hypocrisy rather than divine matters. They targeted the gap between religious teaching and clerical behavior safer territory, though still requiring careful delivery. Le Glorieux, jester to Charles the Bold of Burgundy in the 15th century, once pointed at a fat abbot during a feast and remarked that the holy man seemed to have interpreted abstinence as meaning two of everything. The court laughed, the abbot forced a smile, and Le Glorieux survived, partly because he'd targeted the man's behavior rather than his office or faith. Even papal courts had jesters, which might seem surprising given the Church's official position on frivolity. Pope Leo X, 1513 to 1521, kept several fools, including the famous Mariano Fetti. These papal jesters walked an even narrower line, permitted to amuse but never to mock anything that might undermine the Church's authority or teachings. The point is, when you joked about religious matters, you weren't just risking offense. You were potentially endangering your immortal soul, at least according to the beliefs of the time. Not exactly the supportive environment most comedians hope for. Noble egos and deadly feuds. Below the monarch, but constantly jockeying for position, were the nobles. A collection of titled individuals whose egos were as expansive as their lands and whose sensitivities were as delicate as the finest Venetian glass. Medieval nobility wasn't just rich people with fancy houses. They were a military class, trained from childhood in the arts of warfare, with private armies at their disposal, and the expectation that violence was a perfectly reasonable way to settle disagreements. These were people who considered hitting someone with a metal stick until they fell down a prestigious competitive sport. Tournaments weren't just entertainment. They were practice for the real violence that structured medieval society. Noble feuds could last generations, with each side keeping meticulous track of slights, insults, and grievances. The Guelph and Ghibelline factions in medieval Italy maintained their bitter rivalry for over 3 centuries. The Percy Neville feud in England helped spark the Wars of the Roses. These weren't petty disagreements. They were blood vendettas that could erupt into open violence at the slightest provocation. Now imagine trying to tell jokes to people from both sides of such a feud at the same dinner without accidentally implying support for either faction. As the court jester, you had to maintain a mental catalog of who hated whom, which families had ancient grudges, who had recently married or divorced or been widowed under suspicious circumstances. You needed to know which noble had just lost land in a court case, which one had embarrassed themselves at the last tournament, which one was rumored to be unable to produce an heir. And you had to craft humor that navigated all these sensitivities while still being, actually funny. Sometimes jesters would deliberately play with these tensions through what we might now call crowd work, making calculated observations that acknowledged the elephant in the room without explicitly taking sides. It was verbal tightrope walking without a net. Historical records mention a jester at the court of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, who diffused a tense moment between feuding nobles by pretending to mistake them for brothers, exclaiming loudly about their remarkable family resemblance. a joke that simultaneously acknowledged their rivalry while forcing them to laugh together rather than reach for daggers. Physical comedy often provided a safer alternative to verbal wit in these situations. When words could be interpreted as taking sides, a well-timed pratfall or comical dance was politically neutral. This is partly why physical comedy, juggling, acrobatics, silly dances, was such a significant part of the jester's repertoire. It wasn't just entertaining, it was survival strategy. Foreign dignitaries and diplomatic disasters. If court politics weren't complicated enough, throw in some foreign diplomats for extra lethality. Medieval courts constantly hosted ambassadors, envoys, and visitors from other realms, each with their own cultural sensitivities, language barriers, and political agendas. Medieval diplomacy wasn't conducted through carefully worded emails and translated policy documents. It was face-to-face, high-stakes theater where appearances mattered as much as substance. A perceived insult to a foreign ambassador could literally start a war. As the court jester, you were often used as a diplomatic tool, entertaining foreign visitors, helping break ice, and occasionally delivering messages too delicate for formal channels. But this role came with monumental risks. What was funny in England might be deeply offensive in France. A gesture considered amusing in Christian courts could be insulting or blasphemous to Muslim diplomats. Even getting someone's title slightly wrong could create an international incident. In 1444, a French jester performing for English ambassadors during truce negotiations made a joke about English military defeats. The English delegation nearly walked out, potentially derailing fragile peace talks. The jester was flogged, and the French king had to make a formal apology. One of the few documented cases where we know a jester's failed joke had direct diplomatic consequences. Language barriers created additional hazards. Most jesters weren't multilingual scholars. They performed through a combination of physical comedy, exaggerated expressions, and simple verbal jokes that could often be misinterpreted across language divides. Some courts specifically chose jesters with language abilities to help with diplomatic functions. Jan Smeeken, court jester at the Brussels court in the early 16th century, reportedly spoke 5 languages and was specifically deployed to entertain foreign dignitaries. His linguistic skills made him exceptionally valuable and gave him a better chance of avoiding catastrophic misunderstandings. Medieval diplomatic protocols were labyrinthine and varied widely between cultures. The Byzantine court had particularly elaborate ceremonial requirements that visiting diplomats often found bewildering. Islamic courts had specific rules about representations of living beings that affected what kinds of performances were acceptable. Northern European courts had different expectations than Mediterranean ones about physical contact and personal space. A jester had to navigate all these cultural differences while maintaining the appearance of simple foolery. Make a mistake with the local duke and you might lose your position. Make a mistake with the Byzantine emperor's envoy, and your monarch might lose a trading partnership worth thousands of gold pieces. No pressure. The art of survival through oblique truth-telling. So how did jesters survive this minefield? Through a sophisticated art form that combined psychological insight, linguistic cleverness, and the strategic use of absurdity as camouflage. The animal fables mentioned in the original text. The rooster who crows too early may find himself in the stew, weren't just cute metaphors. They were sophisticated rhetorical devices that created plausible deniability. If accused of criticizing the king's hasty declaration of war, the jester could innocently claim he was just telling a simple barnyard tale. This technique had ancient roots. Aesop's fables, dating back to ancient Greece, used animal characters to convey political and social criticism safely. Medieval jesters adapted this approach, creating their own fables tailored to specific court situations. Court records describe jesters developing elaborate nonsense languages or speaking styles that sounded meaningless but contained coded criticisms understandable to regular listeners. Triboulet, jester to Francis VII of France, was famous for his seemingly disconnected ramblings that actually contained pointed observations about court politics, but encoded in a way that made them difficult to directly challenge. Some jesters employed the fool's privilege of pretending to misunderstand basic concepts, asking naive questions that actually highlighted logical flaws in policies or plans. "Forgive my simple mind, your majesty, but if we burn all the villages to punish the rebels, where will we collect taxes from next year?" A political criticism disguised as foolish confusion. Jesters also mastered what we might now call the callback, referring obliquely to previous events in ways only certain audience members would recognize. This created inside jokes that could carry subversive messages while appearing innocent to others. Many developed signature routines or characters that gave them additional layers of protection. By performing as an established character, the drunken fool, the love-struck buffoon, the simple country bumpkin, they could express perspectives that would be dangerous coming directly from themselves. Perhaps most importantly, successful jesters developed an intuitive understanding of timing and tone. They knew exactly when a powerful person was receptive to criticism and when they should stick to simple slapstick. They could read a room's political temperature with the precision of a modern thermometer. We know this because the jesters who failed to master these skills don't appear much in historical records, or they appear only briefly, their careers ending in dismissal, punishment, or worse. The ones we have extensive records of were the survivors, the ones who turned verbal camouflage into an art form. The cost of the constant performance. Living constantly on this edge exacted a psychological toll rarely mentioned in colorful depictions of medieval court life. The jester walked a mental tightrope every day, with potential disaster waiting on either side. Historical accounts suggest many jesters developed what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders or extreme stress responses. Court records describe several royal fools suffering from trembling hands, stuttering that worsened during high-pressure performances, or mysterious ailments that manifested before particularly difficult court events. The necessity of maintaining a constant comic persona of always being on created a kind of performative prison. Even in theoretically private moments, jesters were expected to maintain their foolish character. There was rarely space to process the complex emotions their position generated. Some jesters developed elaborate coping mechanisms. Historical accounts mention court fools who maintained small private spaces, a window alcove, a bench in a quiet garden, where they would retreat when not actively performing. These brief respites seem to have been vital to maintaining their mental equilibrium. Records also show that some jesters formed close bonds with similar court outsiders, musicians, foreign scholars, court dwarfs, or others who existed on the social periphery. These relationships provided rare opportunities for authentic connection in an environment where most interactions were performance-based. The isolation mentioned in the original text, which made you a little terrifying, and very, very alone, was a fundamental reality of jester life. You knew things others didn't. You said things others couldn't. You occupied a unique social space that no one else could fully understand. This isolation was compounded by the fact that jesters rarely had families within the court context. While some eventually married, particularly after establishing themselves securely in a court position, many lived essentially solitary lives. Their social status made them undesirable marriage partners for court servants who wanted to rise in the hierarchy and their proximity to power made them potentially dangerous connections for ordinary townspeople. The psychological burden of constantly disguising criticism as comedy, of navigating lethal social complexities while maintaining the appearance of simple foolery, of never being able to relax fully in any social context. This was the hidden cost of wearing the cap and bells. The jester's legacy, truth-tellers in troubled times. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, court jesters developed a unique cultural role that transcended mere entertainment. They became society's designated truth-tellers, using humor to pierce pretension and speak reality to power. In a world structured around elaborate falsehoods, the flattery of courtiers, the posturing of nobles, the performative piety that often masked corruption, the jester's oblique honesty was revolutionary. Their ability to acknowledge the obvious but unspeakable truths made them both valuable and dangerous. This truth-telling function appears repeatedly in medieval literature and art. In Shakespeare's King Lear, the fool speaks honest truth to the increasingly irrational king when everyone else fears to do so. In medieval morality plays, fool characters often delivered the moral message directly to the audience. Court records describe historical jesters using humor to warn monarchs about everything from corrupt officials to dangerous military strategies. Chicot, jester to Henry III of France, reputedly saved the king's life by warning him of assassination plots. Information he gathered because people spoke more freely around someone they perceived as just a fool. Will Somers, Henry VIII's jester, reportedly prevented several innocent courtiers from execution by making jokes that highlighted the flimsy evidence against them. This truth-telling role came at tremendous personal risk, but served a crucial social function. In rigid hierarchical systems with limited formal channels for criticism, jesters created essential pressure valves. They allowed uncomfortable truths to surface before tensions reached explosive levels. So yes, every joke had teeth. Every pun had politics. And walking that razor-thin line between witty and whipped required extraordinary skill. But in those moments when a well-placed jest actually changed a monarch's mind, prevented an unjust action, or simply acknowledged the unspoken truth everyone was desperately avoiding. In those moments, perhaps the jester's precarious position served a purpose beyond mere entertainment. The cap and bells came with mortal danger, but they also conferred a unique kind of freedom in a world where freedom was exceedingly rare. The license, however limited and dangerous, to speak truth disguised as foolishness. A freedom that could kill you, but a freedom nonetheless. A brief sleepy history of the fool. Now, before you drift too far into the pillow, let's slow things down and step gently, bells optional, into the real history of the medieval jester. Because yes, they were real. And no, they weren't just clowns with wine breath. The idea of the fool existed long before medieval castles had indoor plumbing, or walls that kept the wind out for that matter. You can trace the role all the way back to the ancient world. In ancient Egypt, performers were sometimes invited to lighten the mood of pharaohs. In Rome, wealthy households kept entertainers around, some of them enslaved, many of them clever enough to survive imperial dinner parties without being thrown to the lions. Literally. But the true golden age of the court jester, or maybe its most glittering cage, was in medieval and Renaissance Europe. These were professional jesters, real people, real job title, and believe it or not, some of them even had official contracts. In England, they were sometimes called *** licensed fools, ***. Yes, there were documents. Being funny wasn't just a vibe, it was a regulated career. The most famous among them. *** Will Somers *** court fool to Henry VIII. Somehow, this man made it through *6 wives, multiple beheadings, and the general Tudor moodiness, and kept his job. Which may have been the most impressive thing anyone did in that court. In France, there was Triboulet, Jester to King Francis I. He was witty, sharp-tongued, and once insulted a noble so badly that the man demanded his execution. The king, amused but not entirely unreasonable, told Triboulet he could choose how he'd die. Triboulet thought for a moment and replied, "By old age." He lived. Jesters didn't always dress ridiculously either. That whole mismatched patchwork outfit with bells and pointy shoes, it did exist, especially in later centuries, but many fools dressed more subtly, even fashionably, especially if they were what we'd now call clever fools valued for their satire and intelligence more than their pratfalls. There were two main types: natural fools, often people with physical or cognitive differences mocked for their appearance, and artificial fools, trained performers, sharp, observant, and occasionally terrifying in how well they read a room. And yes, some were paid. Not well, but paid. In 13th century England, royal records show that a jester named Roland Le Pétour was given a manor, an actual manor for jumping, whistling, and farting. That's not a joke. That's in the records. He literally passed gas for property, but the job came with risk, always. Because being a fool meant speaking truth in a room where truth was not always welcome. They were expected to make fun of the powerful, but only when it was convenient. They were allowed to mock the church, but not the wrong bishop. They were welcome to joke about war, unless the kingdom was losing. It was a constant game of who can I make laugh without dying. So yes, jesters were real, respected in a way, feared in a different way, but protected? Not quite. The moment the laughter stopped, the danger started. Ancient roots, when pharaohs needed a chuckle. Let's travel back a bit further than those drafty medieval castles, all the way to ancient Egypt, where the concept of court entertainment was already well established by 2500 BCE. Pharaohs, despite being living gods, or so they claimed, apparently still got bored. Egyptian tomb paintings showed dwarfs and other performers entertaining the royal court. These weren't exactly jesters in the medieval sense, but they certainly laid the groundwork for the profession. One particularly interesting Egyptian entertainer was Jeho, who served in the court of Pharaoh Pepi II around 2200 BCE. Hieroglyphic records suggest Jeho was valued not just for his physical comedy, but for his storytelling abilities. The pharaoh was reportedly so fond of Jeho that when the performer died, he was granted the rare honor of a tomb near the royal pyramid. Not bad for someone whose job description included, "Make the god king snort with laughter." The ancient Egyptians had a complex relationship with humor. They produced satirical papyri showing animals acting as humans. Cats serving mice, for instance, which suggests they understood the comedic value of turning the natural order upside down. Sound familiar? That's essentially what court jesters would do millennia later. In ancient Greece, similar roles emerged. The Greeks didn't have jesters per se, but they had parasites, parasitos. Not the intestinal kind, but professional dinner guests who earned their meals by being amusing. These weren't just freeloaders. They were expected to provide witty conversation, clever jokes, and flattery in exchange for their place at the table. Philip of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, kept a famous parasite named Aristodemus around. Historical records suggest Aristodemus once saved himself from the king's anger by making such a clever joke about Philip's well-known eye injury that the monarch laughed instead of punishing him. The ability to diffuse royal rage with humor would become a crucial jester skill. By the time we reach Rome, dedicated entertainers were a common feature in wealthy households. The Romans called them *moriones* or *fatui*, terms that unfortunately referred to people with developmental disabilities who were kept as natural fools for entertainment. It's an uncomfortable historical truth that much early court entertainment involved laughing at rather than with people who were different. Not all Roman entertainers fell into this category, though. By the late Republic and early Empire periods, more sophisticated performers emerged. The *scurae*, professional jesters who combined physical comedy with verbal wit. These performers sometimes enjoyed significant social mobility. One famous scura named Gaba became so valuable to Emperor Augustus that he was eventually granted equestrian rank, the Roman equivalent of being knighted. Cicero, that verbose Roman statesman, actually wrote about the importance of humor in his work De Oratore, discussing how even serious political figures needed to understand comedy. He distinguished between two types of humor, *facetiae*, refined wit, and *decusitis*, biting sarcasm. This distinction would shape court humor for centuries to come. Roman court entertainers established another tradition that would carry forward to medieval jesters. The idea that fools had license to speak uncomfortable truths. Senator Cassius Dio records an incident where a fool named Sarmentus publicly joked about Emperor Augustus's affair with a Vestal virgin, something that would have earned anyone else a swift execution. Augustus reportedly laughed, albeit uncomfortably, and Sarmentus survived. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire disrupted many cultural institutions, but the tradition of court entertainment wasn't one of them. As Europe fractured into smaller kingdoms during what we now call the early Middle Ages, roughly 500–1000 CE, local rulers maintained their own versions of court entertainers, the Byzantine buffoon and the Islamic nadim. While Western Europe was figuring itself out after Rome's collapse, the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, maintained an unbroken tradition of court entertainers. Byzantine emperors employed what they called gelatopoioi, literally laughter makers. Byzantine court foolery came with specific protocols. Unlike Western jesters who eventually gained some freedom to mock their masters, Byzantine fools directed their humor at court officials, but rarely at the emperor himself. The imperial presence was too sacred for direct mockery. One notable Byzantine gelotopios was Boilas, who served Emperor Michael III in the 9th century. Historical records suggest Boilas specialized in religious parody, dressing as a bishop and performing mock ceremonies, risky business in a deeply orthodox society. Michael's enjoyment of these sacrilegious performances was actually cited as evidence of his unfitness to rule when he was eventually assassinated. Sometimes the jester's comedy could damage the reputation of the very patron who encouraged it. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, courts developed their own tradition of entertainment. The *nadim*, companion, combined elements of fool, advisor, and drinking buddy to the caliph or sultan. The Abbasid courts of Baghdad were particularly known for these sophisticated entertainers. Abu Nuwas, a famous 8th century poet who served as Nadim to Caliph Harun al-Rashid, yes, the one from the Arabian Nights, pushed the boundaries of acceptable humor in Islamic society. He wrote wine poems celebrating drunkenness and homosexual love. both technically forbidden, yet his wit was so valued that he survived, though not without occasional punishments. Islamic court entertainment differed from its European counterpart in crucial ways. Islamic society's prohibition against depicting humans meant less emphasis on costume and physical appearance. Instead, wordplay, poetry, and storytelling took center stage. The Nadim needed to be genuinely educated, with knowledge of literature, history, and theology to craft his sophisticated humor. The medieval fool takes shape. As Europe emerged from the early Middle Ages into the High Medieval period, roughly 1000 to 1300 CE, the court jester as we more commonly imagine them began to take shape. The 11th and 12th centuries saw European courts becoming more elaborate and ceremonial. Kings and great nobles established permanent households rather than constantly traveling with their entire retinue. This stability allowed for specialized roles to develop, including dedicated entertainers. Early medieval jesters were often lumped together with minstrels, bards, and other traveling performers. They might visit a court for a season or a festival, but weren't yet the institutional fixtures they would become. Records from William the Conqueror's court mention payments to ** joculator Regius *, king's entertainer, but don't specify a permanent position. By the 13th century, this had changed. Court records begin to show regular payments to individuals specifically described as fools or jesters. The household book of Eleanor of Castile, wife of England's Edward I, mentions payments to a fool named Robert in 1288. This is the same century that gave us Roland le Péteur, Roland the Farter, mentioned in the original text. And yes, his story is completely true and documented in the royal records. King Henry II granted him Hemmingstone Manor in Suffolk and 30 acres of land in exchange for his unique performance, unum saltum et siffletum et unum bombulum, one jump, one whistle, and one fart, performed before the king each Christmas. Roland's case illustrates an important point. Medieval jesters often had specific performance skills beyond just being funny. Some were acrobats, others jugglers, some musicians, and apparently some had unusual physical talents. The 13th century also gives us the first clear distinction between natural and artificial fools. Natural fools were individuals with physical or cognitive differences who were kept as entertainment. Court records often described them with terms like innocent or simple. Artificial fools were trained performers who adopted the fool's persona deliberately. This distinction wasn't always clear-cut. Some natural fools were clearly more capable than their patrons acknowledged, using their designated role to gain privileges and protection. Some artificial fools exaggerated or feigned simplicity to avoid blame for particularly risky jokes. The medieval period saw jesters spread beyond royal courts to noble households, monasteries, and even wealthy merchant homes. Guild records from 14th century Florence mention members specifically designated as buffoni, who could be hired for private entertainments. What did these medieval jesters actually do? Their performances combined elements of what we'd now separate into different entertainment categories: physical comedy, acrobatics, juggling, mime, music, singing, playing instruments, verbal wit, puns, riddles, impromptu verses, mimicry, impersonating court figures or visitors, storytelling, recounting tales with comic embellishments. A skilled jester would adapt their performance to the specific audience and occasion. Private entertainment for the monarch might feature more daring political humor, while public court feasts required broader, more accessible comedy. Medieval household accounts give us occasional glimpses of jester compensation. In 1393, Charles VI of France ordered his treasurer to pay 200 francs to his fool Hanselin Coq for good and agreeable services. The same records show Hanselin received new clothes quarterly and had 2 servants assigned to him, suggesting some jesters lived quite comfortably. The Golden Age, Renaissance fools, and formalization. The Renaissance, roughly 1400 to 1600 CE, marked what we might call the professional peak of the court jester. This period saw the role formalized, documented, and integrated into court hierarchy in unprecedented ways. By the 15th century, major European courts maintained multiple fools with different specialties. The Burgundian court, one of the most elaborate in Europe, had records of at least 4 different jesters serving simultaneously, each with defined roles. Le Glorieux specialized in witty verbal comedy, while another named Coquinet performed acrobatics and physical stunts. This period gave us some of the most well-documented jesters in history, those rare few whose personalities and specific jokes survived in the historical record. Will Sommers, mentioned in the original text, truly was an extraordinary case of jester longevity, serving Henry VIII. From around 1525 until the king's death in 1547, Sommers navigated the treacherous Tudor court with remarkable skill. Contemporary accounts describe him as lean, hollow-eyed, and sharp-nosed, not the rotund figure later depictions would make him. Sommers' surviving quips show his particular talent for delivering uncomfortable truths under the guise of simple observations. When Henry was dissolving the monasteries and seizing their wealth, Sommers reportedly asked the king, "What a number of friars and nuns you have made to beg their bread, and yet they were poor enough before." The observation was factual, not explicitly critical, yet it highlighted the human cost of the king's policies. Remarkably, Sommers continued serving under Edward VI and Mary I after Henry's death, a rare example of a jester outlasting his original patron. His longevity was likely due to his ability to calibrate his humor perfectly to changing political circumstances. Triboulet, the French jester mentioned earlier, has been immortalized in various works of art and literature, including Victor Hugo's Le Roi s'amuse, which later became Verdi's opera Rigoletto. The historical Triboulet served 2 French kings, Charles VIII and Louis XIV, before reaching his most famous period under Francis I. Court records describe Triboulet as having a big head on a small body, possibly suggesting microcephaly. Whether this physical difference was exploited for comedy, or whether Triboulet used his wit to transcend it is a matter of historical debate. What's undeniable is his quick thinking. The anecdote about choosing to die of old age, when asked to select his method of execution, is documented in multiple sources. Another famous Triboulet story involves him slapping the king on the buttocks, a shocking breach of protocol. When Francis I informed him that anyone who struck the king would be executed, Triboulet purportedly replied, "What if I struck you with your own hand?" and proceeded to place the king's hand on his backside. Francis allegedly laughed instead of punishing him. The Renaissance period saw jesters not only at Christian European courts, but also in the Islamic Ottoman Empire, Mughal India, and Ming Dynasty China. Each cultural context shaped the specific form of court foolery. In Ottoman courts, jesters called asterisk mascaras. Asterisk entertained sultans with a combination of witty conversation and mimicry. Unlike their European counterparts, Ottoman mascaras performed without elaborate costumes, instead relying on verbal humor and storytelling. Mughal Emperor Akbar the Great maintained a famously witty jester named Birbal, whose clever solutions to the emperor's riddles and problems have become part of Indian folklore. The tales of Akbar and Birbal continue to be popular children's stories in India today. Ming Dynasty records mention court jesters called asterisk urine asterisk, who combined elements of comedy with musical performance and acrobatics. One famous Yuan named Shi Dongtong reportedly saved several courtiers from execution through his timely comedic interventions with the Zhengde emperor. Historical jesters who changed history. Some jesters did more than entertain. They actually influenced historical events through their unique position. These instances where the cap and bells somehow altered the course of affairs give us insight into how the fool's privileged position could occasionally translate into real impact. In 1340, a Polish court jester named Stancik reportedly influenced King Sigismund's decision to stay out of a disastrous military campaign against Moldova. When the king asked why the jester looked sad while everyone else celebrated an anticipated victory, Stancik replied that the court rejoiced before the battle while he would grieve after it. His pessimistic prediction proved accurate, and Sigismund later credited the jester with attempting to warn him. Archibald Armstrong, court jester to James I of England and later Charles I, became so politically influential that he was referred to as Archie the King's Fool in diplomatic correspondence. Armstrong used his position to broker patronage arrangements and allegedly received bribes to influence royal decisions. His eventual downfall came when he insulted Archbishop Laud once too often, calling him the great and fat fool. Laud, not amused, convinced King Charles to dismiss Armstrong in 1637. Jane Fool, one of the rare female jesters documented in historical records, served both Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth wife, and later Mary I. Court accounts suggest Jane used her fool's privilege to speak candidly to Queen Mary about Protestant prisoners during the Marian persecutions, possibly softening the Queen's approach in some cases. Jane's position as one of the few people who could make the infamously stern Mary laugh gave her unusual influence. Chicot, jester to Francis Henri III and later Henry IV, served as both entertainer and spy. During the wars of religion that tore through 16th century France, Chicot gathered intelligence from the Catholic League and the Huguenot factions, delivering it to the king disguised as jests and stories. In 1585, he reportedly intercepted secret correspondence that revealed a plot against the king, hiding the letters in his fool's marotte, scepter. In a particularly dramatic incident, Chicot actually captured the enemy commander, the Comte de Chaligny, during the Battle of Arques in 1589. When Chaligny surrendered to someone he believed was a nobleman, Chicot revealed himself as the king's jester and insisted the Comte had surrendered to a fool. Henri IV found this so amusing that he ransomed Chaligny for a substantial sum, with the money going to Chicot personally. Female fools, the overlooked jesters. While the popular image of the court jester is almost always male, historical records reveal a small but significant number of female jesters who deserve recognition. Their stories offer a different perspective on the fool's role and the unique challenges faced by women in this unusual profession. Jane Fool, mentioned above, is one of the best documented female jesters. Royal wardrobe accounts show she received elaborate clothing, including a French gown of yellow damask and petticoats furred with miniver, a type of fur, suggesting she was treated as a valued member of Queen Mary's household. Unlike many male jesters who performed physical comedy or used crude humor, Jane appears to have specialized in witty conversation and sharp observations. Her particular talent seems to have been coaxing smiles from the notoriously somber Mary Tudor, whose reign was marked by illness and political tension. Another notable female jester was Mathurine de Valois, who served at the French court under Henry III, Henry IV, and Louis XIII, an impressive span of 3 monarchs from 1584 to 1627. Mathurine was described as quick with a retort and apparently specialized in political satire. During a Spanish diplomatic visit, she reportedly appeared dressed as a Spanish infantryman, causing momentary panic before delivering a satirical speech mocking Spanish military pretensions. In 1593, Mathurine was present during an assassination attempt on Henri IV. When the king was stabbed by Jean Châtel, Mathurine was initially suspected of involvement. She reportedly responded to these accusations with sufficient wit that she not only cleared herself but remained in royal favor. La Jardinière, whose real name is lost to history, served as fool to Queen Maria Theresa of Spain, wife of Louis XIV, in the 17th century. Court records suggest she specialized in body humor that contrasted with the queen's own reserved nature. One account describes La Jardinière mimicking the exaggerated courtly bows of Louis's courtiers, reducing the homesick Spanish queen to helpless laughter. Female jesters appear to have been more common in women's households, serving queens, princesses, and noble ladies rather than kings. This gender segregation reflected broader social patterns of the medieval and Renaissance periods, where women's and men's social spheres were often separate. The performance styles of female jesters may have differed from their male counterparts. While male fools often engaged in physical comedy, female jesters seem to have specialized more in verbal wit, storytelling, and personalized entertainment. This likely reflected period expectations about appropriate female behavior, even for women in such unconventional roles. Court dwarfs, between jester and status symbol. Closely related to the court jester tradition was the practice of maintaining court dwarfs, individuals of short stature who served both as entertainers and as living symbols of the patron's wealth and power. While not technically jesters, their role overlapped significantly and deserves exploration. Court dwarfs appear in records from ancient Egypt through the Renaissance, with particular prominence in Habsburg Spain and Medici Italy. Unlike jesters, who were valued primarily for their wit or performance skills, dwarfs were initially valued simply for their physical difference, which was considered exotic or unusual. Over time, many court dwarfs developed entertainment skills to secure their position, essentially becoming specialized jesters. Some formed partnerships with court jesters, with the dwarf playing straight man to the jester's humor. Geoffrey Hudson, perhaps the most famous court dwarf in English history, served Queen Henrietta Maria, wife of Charles I, from 1626. Known as Lord Minimus and the Queen's Dwarf, Hudson stood just 19 inches tall at age 7 when he entered royal service, and reportedly grew to only 3 feet 9 inches as an adult. Hudson's story illustrates the complex status of court dwarfs. He was presented to the Queen inside a pie as a gift, literally treated as an object. Yet he was also educated, trained in courtly manners, and eventually knighted. His position blended elements of jester, pet, status symbol, and courtier. Unlike many court entertainers, Hudson bristled at being treated as a joke. In 1644, after a military officer mocked his stature once too often, Hudson challenged the man to a duel and actually killed him with a pistol shot. This dramatic assertion of dignity led to Hudson's exile from court, though he was later reconciled with the Queen. Spanish court dwarfs achieved particular prominence in the Habsburg courts, where they were frequently depicted in royal portraits. Diego Velázquez's paintings of the Spanish court include remarkably dignified portrayals of dwarfs like Sebastián de Mora and Diego de Acedo, suggesting these individuals held complex social positions beyond mere entertainment. Court records indicate that some dwarfs received substantial compensation and privileges. Mari Barbola, a female dwarf in the court of Philip IV of Spain, received a monthly stipend equal to that of other court officials, and had her own servant. Like jesters, skilled court dwarfs could leverage their unique position into a relatively comfortable life, despite their marginalized status. The relationship between dwarfs and jesters in court hierarchies varied. In some courts, they occupied similar social positions and even performed together. In others, dwarfs actually ranked above jesters, particularly if they had additional duties as chamber servants or confidants to their patrons. The fall from fashion when jesters lost their jobs. As the Renaissance gave way to the Enlightenment, the traditional court jester began to fade from European courts. This decline wasn't sudden, but rather a gradual shift in courtly taste and political structure. By the late 17th century, most major European courts had abandoned the formal position of court jester. England's last official court jester was Muckle John, who served Charles I until the king's execution in 1649. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, Charles II did not appoint a new jester, preferring the more sophisticated wit of comic actors and writers like Samuel Pepys. In France, the tradition lingered slightly longer. Louis XIV, the Sun King, employed a jester named L'Angely early in his reign. But by the time Versailles reached its height of formality and ceremony, the position had been eliminated. The increasingly ritualized French court had no place for the jester's disruptive humor. Several factors contributed to the jester's decline. 1. Rising formality in court culture. As courts became more ceremonial and regulated, the jester's spontaneous, sometimes disruptive presence became less acceptable. 2. Professionalization of entertainment. The growth of public theaters and professional acting companies offered rulers access to more sophisticated entertainment without keeping permanent fools. 3. Changing political structures. As absolute monarchy gradually gave way to more constitutional forms, the need for the jester's role as informal truth-teller diminished. 4. Enlightenment sensibilities. Emerging views on human dignity made keeping natural fools for entertainment increasingly distasteful to educated elites. Court jesters hung on longest in Russia, where Peter the Great maintained several fools into the early 18th century. Peter's jesters were often noblemen who had displeased him, forced to wear fool's motley as punishment, a particularly Russian twist on the tradition. The last documented professional court jester might be Nasir el-Dawla, who served Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II in the late 19th century. By then, the role had evolved far from its medieval origins, but still maintained the core function of providing privileged humor to power. While the official position disappeared, the jester's cultural DNA survived in other forms. Royal courts might no longer keep fools, but satirists, caricaturists, and political humorists continued to fill the societal need for truth-telling through humor. Jonathan Swift, writing in the early 18th century, could be considered a literary descendant of the court jester tradition, using absurdity and satire to deliver uncomfortable truths. In a sense, the jester never truly disappeared. The cap and bells were simply exchanged for printing presses, political cartoons, satirical journals, and eventually stand-up microphones. Global jester traditions. Not just a European phenomenon. While we've focused primarily on European court jesters, it's worth noting that similar traditions existed across cultures worldwide, each with their own distinctive characteristics. In Japan, a figure somewhat parallel to the Western jester was the taikomochi male entertainers who used humor, music, and storytelling to amuse the powerful. Originally serious performers of ritual dances in the Heian period, 794 1185 CE. By the Edo period, 1603 to 1867, taikomochi had evolved into sophisticated entertainers who combined elements of jester, storyteller, and companion. Unlike European jesters who often adopted a fool's persona, taikomochi were respected for their intelligence and cultural knowledge. They were expected to be well-versed in poetry, literature, and history, using this education to craft nuanced entertainment for samurai and daimyo, feudal lords. In the Aztec Empire, court entertainers called *Tlaquetzki* performed for the emperor. Spanish accounts describe these performers using elaborate costumes, mimicry, and humorous stories to entertain the Aztec nobility. Unlike European jesters, Tlaquetzki often performed in groups and incorporated religious elements into their performances. African royal courts maintained their own jester traditions. In the Kingdom of Dahomey, modern-day Benin, royal jesters called *Goha*, entertained kings with a combination of physical comedy, songs, and pointed humor. Like their European counterparts, Goha enjoyed the privilege of speaking uncomfortable truths to power. Records suggest they often criticized royal decisions through indirect stories and parables. The Chinese imperial courts employed performers called *Yuan*, mentioned earlier, from at least the Han Dynasty onward. Chinese court jesters differed from their European counterparts in several key ways. They typically came from educated backgrounds, often using their humor to deliver political advice or moral lessons. Rather than adopting a fool persona, they maintained dignity while using wit to influence the emperor. One famous Chinese jester, Chun Yukun, served at the court of King Wei of Qi during the Warring States period. Historical records in the Shiji, Records of the Grand Historian, document how Chunyu used humor to convince the king to abandon a plan to attack a neighboring state, saving countless lives through carefully crafted comedy. These global traditions suggest that the need for humor as a safety valve for power and as a vehicle for difficult truths transcends cultural boundaries. While the specific forms varied widely, the core social function remained remarkably consistent across civilizations. Jesters in literature and legacy. Long after real jesters disappeared from courts, their image has remained vivid in our collective imagination, preserved and sometimes transformed through literature and art. Shakespeare's fools represent perhaps the most sophisticated literary treatment of the jester. Characters like Feste in Twelfth Night, Touchstone in As You Like It, and the Fool in King Lear are far more than comic relief. They're philosophical commentators who use humor to deliver the play's deepest insights. The Fool in King Lear most clearly embodies the truth-telling function of the historical jester. When everyone else either flatters the increasingly irrational king or abandons him, only the fool speaks honestly, telling Lear, "Thou shouldst not have been old till thou hadst been wise." His disappearance halfway through the play, after Lear has begun to recognize his folly, suggests that once truth is acknowledged, the jester's role is complete. Shakespeare wrote these characters at a time when real court jesters were still employed, suggesting his depictions may capture something authentic about the psychological complexity of the role. His fools are simultaneously insiders and outsiders, privileged and vulnerable, witty and melancholic. Medieval literature also featured jester characters, though usually with less psychological depth. In Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the mysterious Green Knight initially appears at Arthur's court in the guise of a fool before revealing his true supernatural nature. This literary device plays on the jester's liminality, their existence between social categories. The jester's image evolved significantly in later literature, Victor Hugo's Le Roi s'amuse, 1832, transformed the historical Triboulet into a tragic figure, a mistreated fool seeking revenge against the aristocracy that had humiliated him. This romanticized, darkened version of the Jester influenced later depictions, including Verdi's opera Rigoletto, based on Hugo's play. By the 19th century, as actual jesters had faded into history, their literary image split between the innocent, childlike fool, emphasizing wisdom through simplicity, and the bitter, calculating jester, emphasizing the psychological toll of their position. Both versions contained elements of historical truth, but neither captured the full complexity of the real court jester's precarious existence. Modern popular culture continues to draw on the jester archetype, from comic book characters like Batman's nemesis, the Joker, a dark inversion of the truth-telling fool, to fantasy literature's wise fools and tricksters. Even corporate structures have adopted the concept, with some innovation consultants explicitly styling themselves as modern corporate jesters who can speak uncomfortable truths about organizational problems. The enduring fascination with jesters suggests they touch something fundamental about power relationships and the human need for truth disguised as entertainment. In a world still structured by power hierarchies, perhaps we recognize that we still need fools, those rare individuals with license to say what others cannot. The last laugh. What jesters tell us about power? What can these historical figures, these professional fools who danced along the edge of danger for centuries, teach us about the nature of power and truth? Perhaps most fundamentally, the very existence of jesters reveals something uncomfortable about authority. The fact that powerful people needed to create a specialized role for truth-telling suggests how rarely they heard it otherwise. Surrounded by flattery and fear, medieval and Renaissance rulers created a safety valve, a designated truth-teller whose humorous delivery made honesty palatable. Jesters remind us that power doesn't just corrupt those who wield it, it corrupts the information environment around them. Without mechanisms to break through the bubble of deference and flattery, even well-intentioned rulers become isolated from reality. The jester, licensed to mock, empowered to question, served as a reality check in environments otherwise defined by elaborate fictions of absolute authority. The jester's precarious position, simultaneously privileged and vulnerable, also highlights the fundamental insecurity of power. Even absolute monarchs, it seems, recognized at some level their need for honest feedback. Yet this acknowledgement came wrapped in layers of protective ritual. The feedback could only come from a designated fool, could only be delivered through humor, and could always be dismissed as mere entertainment if it struck too close to home. In a sense, jesters were institutional acknowledgments of power's limitations. Their very presence at court suggested that even divine right monarchs recognized the dangers of unchecked authority and unfiltered information. The historical jester's gradual disappearance tracks with evolving power structures. As governance became more distributed, as public opinion gained influence, as the press developed as a critical voice, the need for an official truth-teller diminished. Other mechanisms, from satirical publications to political cartoons to stand-up comedy, absorbed aspects of the jester's social function. Yet even in our modern world, with its ostensibly democratic structures and free press, we might wonder whether the jester's role has been adequately replaced. When satirists and comedians are praised for saying what everyone's thinking, they're being recognized for fulfilling this ancient social function, speaking uncomfortable truths through the protective veil of humor. So yes, jesters were real. They lived complex, dangerous lives balancing entertainment and candor, trivial silliness and profound insight. They walked the knife edge between speaking truth to power and keeping their heads attached to their shoulders. And in their bell-jingling footsteps, we might recognize our own complicated relationship with authority and truth. Our need for those rare voices who can make us laugh while forcing us to see what we've been working hard to ignore. The moment the laughter stops, the thinking starts. Despite their fall from fashion in royal courts, the essence of the jester lives on. Their spiritual descendants, satirists, comedians, political cartoonists, continue to use humor as a vehicle for truth in ways that would make Triboulet proud. When we laugh at power today, we're participating in a tradition that stretches back to those ancient Egyptian courts, to Roman dinner parties, to medieval great halls. So next time you see someone speaking uncomfortable truths wrapped in jokes, remember, they're wearing invisible bells. The costume has changed, but the dance remains the same. And that, my drowsy friend, is the real history of the fool. A surprisingly serious business for people who supposedly weren't serious at all. Now with more history than your average dinner toast. It's strange, isn't it? You spend your days surrounded by people, nobles, knights, bishops, guests from other kingdoms, and yet you've never felt more alone. And you're not the first. Loneliness, it turns out, was practically part of the job description. Because as much as jesters were allowed to speak freely, they were never truly free. You were expected to perform, not participate. Be present, but never part of the room. Even when you dined in the hall, you stood off to the side, catching the occasional crust of bread or withered fig. But mostly you caught fragments of gossip, of strategy, of betrayal dressed in silk. You were invisible in plain sight, and that made you useful. Historically, jesters weren't just entertainers. They were listeners, the court's least trusted and most informed person. They were expected to observe, to overhear, to report, sometimes directly to the monarch. Take Archibald Armstrong, jester to King James VI and I. He was more than comic relief. He had influence, a voice at court, until he insulted the wrong churchman, and just like that, gone, dismissed. His job and the small sliver of safety it provided vanished with a sentence. Or Jane the Fool, one of the few known female jesters in Tudor England. She served under Queen Mary I and Queen Elizabeth I, which sounds impressive until you realize historians can't agree whether she was a natural fool, a political pawn, or both. Either way, she lived her entire life in the palace and barely left a trace, because that's how it worked. You existed on the edge of the tapestry, always seen, rarely remembered. When a jester died, no song was sung, no monument was built. Maybe someone mentioned your name in passing, maybe not. No family, no land, no legacy. And the irony? You probably knew everyone else's secrets. You may have had more wit than half the council, but to them you were always just the fool, a flicker of amusement, a tool to balance the mood. And when your jokes stopped landing, when your energy faded, when age took your voice, or your knees, or your timing, they didn't promote you. They replaced you, maybe with a newer fool, maybe with a talking monkey. The result was the same. Your story ended in silence. So yes, the feast was grand, the music was sweet, and you, bright and jingly in the middle of it all, were just one joke away from vanishing completely. And history barely blinked. The perpetual outsider, social isolation by design. This profound loneliness wasn't accidental. It was deliberately engineered into the very fabric of the jester's role. Medieval and Renaissance courts operated on elaborate social networks, webs of family connections, political alliances, regional loyalties, and shared interests. Everyone belonged somewhere in this intricate human tapestry, except the jester. Court records reveal how systematically jesters were isolated from normal social structures. They typically weren't allowed to join guilds, participate in town governance, or even worship normally with the court. In many cases, they were explicitly forbidden from forming close relationships with other courtiers, a rule justified as preventing undue influence but effectively ensuring their social isolation. Even their living arrangements reinforced this separation. While other servants often lived in communal quarters where they formed friendships and support networks, jesters frequently had individual chambers, ostensibly a privilege but in practice another form of isolation. At Winchester Castle in the 14th century, records show a small chamber identified as the Fool's Room, located awkwardly between the kitchen and the Great Hall. Physically in the castle, but separated from both the servant community and the noble living areas. This isolation served several purposes. First, it prevented jesters from forming alliances that might make them politically dangerous. A fool with no friends had no faction, no support system to back up any serious challenge to authority. Second, it preserved their unique social position as observers rather than participants. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it maintained the psychological distance necessary for their role as the court's designated other. As anthropologist Victor Turner might have noted, jesters occupied a liminal space, neither fully inside nor outside the community, existing perpetually on the threshold. This liminality was crucial to their function, but devastating to their psychological well-being. The isolation was further reinforced by the jester's distinctive appearance. That motley costume wasn't just colorful. It was a visual reminder of the jester's separation from normal society. Medieval clothing was governed by strict sumptuary laws that dictated exactly what materials, colors, and styles each social rank could wear. By dressing in motley patches of different colors and fabrics stitched together, jesters inhabited a visual no-man's land, belonging to no recognized category. Even language created barriers. Records show that many jesters developed their own distinctive patterns of speech. Unusual rhythms, made-up words, strange metaphors that further separated them from normal discourse. Will Sommers reportedly spoke with distinctive cadences that court members could immediately recognize, even from another room. This isolation had profound psychological impacts. Court records sometimes mention jesters suffering from what they called melancholy or the black bile, what we might today recognize as depression. A 1605 account of French jester Mathurine notes that she often withdrew to her chamber for days, speaking to none, emerging only when summoned to perform. The court's memory. Institutional knowledge without institutional power. Despite their social isolation, or perhaps because of it, jesters accumulated extraordinary knowledge about court functioning. They became living institutional memories, often knowing more about court history, protocols, and personalities than anyone else present. This knowledge made them simultaneously valuable and vulnerable. They knew too much to be fully trusted, yet too much to be easily discarded. John Scogan, court fool to Edward IV of England in the 15th century, reportedly had such detailed knowledge of noble genealogies that he could recite the precise family relationships between any two courtiers. Useful information in a society where marriages and alliances determined political power. Court records suggest Edward occasionally consulted Scogan before making decisions about noble appointments, relying on the jester's encyclopedic knowledge of family histories and past loyalty. Chicot, jester to Henry III and Henry IV of France, demonstrated this institutional memory role during the Wars of Religion. When various noble houses changed allegiances between Catholic and Protestant factions, Chicot kept mental records of who had supported which side at which time. This information proved valuable as the kings tried to determine who could be trusted, with Chicot often delivering these uncomfortable reminders through seemingly casual jokes about past loyalties. The jester's knowledge extended beyond mere facts to include understanding of court dynamics and personalities. As long-term observers who interacted with everyone from kitchen servants to visiting dignitaries, they developed nuanced understandings of how the court actually worked, not just its formal structures, but its informal power networks and psychological realities. In 1576, an incident at the court of Elizabeth I demonstrates this function. During negotiations with French envoys over a potential marriage alliance, the Queen's fool, Morgan, reportedly made a joke about a similar failed negotiation 20 years earlier, subtly reminding the Queen of diplomatic tactics that had been successful in the past. Court records note that Elizabeth smiled particularly at this jest, and subsequently adopted a negotiating position similar to the one she had used in the earlier talks. This institutional memory role came with significant dangers. Knowing too much about powerful people's past mistakes, embarrassments, or changes of loyalty made jesters potential threats. They needed to demonstrate constantly that they would use this knowledge only in service to their patron, never against them. Conversely, this knowledge provided a thin layer of protection. A jester who knew too many secrets became risky to dismiss or mistreat. They might take those secrets elsewhere. This delicate balance, knowing enough to be useful but not so much as to become threatening, required constant calibration. The jester's old age. When the laughter faded. The section of the original text about jesters' replacements when age took your voice or your knees or your timing hints at one of the cruelest aspects of jester life, the lack of any retirement plan. Court records reveal the precarious fate of aging jesters. Unlike other court positions that might evolve into less demanding roles as servants aged, a jester who could no longer perform effectively simply lost their value. There was no emeritus status for court fools, no transition to advisory roles or honorable retirement. Some historical cases illuminate this harsh reality. Cephon, jester to James IV of Scotland, appears in royal account books with consistent payments from 1488 until around 1510, when the payments suddenly decrease and then stop. Court letters suggest he developed what might have been arthritis, limiting his physical comedy. With no family and no alternative skills, records indicate he was eventually housed in a monastery, essentially as an act of charity. Triboulet, the famous French jester mentioned earlier, fared somewhat better. As he aged and his performances became less energetic, King Francis I granted him a small pension and a cottage on royal lands. This was exceptional treatment, however, and probably reflected Triboulet's unusual status as one of the most famous jesters in French history. Even with this relative good fortune, historical records suggest he died in relative poverty and obscurity. For female jesters, the situation could be even more precarious. Jane Fool, who served Mary I and Elizabeth I, disappears from royal account books around 1558, when she would have been middle-aged. Unlike her male counterpart Will Somers, who received a royal pension in his later years, Jane's fate after her active service is unrecorded. This silence in the historical record itself speaks volumes about the disposability of jesters once their entertainment value diminished. The physical toll of jester performances made aging particularly problematic for these court entertainers. Many jester routines involved physically demanding elements, acrobatics, energetic dances, contortions, and pratfalls. A jester in their 40s or 50s simply couldn't perform the same routines that had initially secured their position. Mental decline posed an even greater threat. A jester's primary value lay in their quick wit and ability to read social situations with precision. Any cognitive decline directly threatened their fundamental purpose. Court records occasionally mention jesters being removed from service after making inappropriate jokes or failing to recognize subtle social cues, problems that might have reflected age-related cognitive changes rather than deliberate misconduct. This disposability was particularly cruel given the specialized nature of the jester's skills. Unlike other court servants who might have marketable abilities, a cook could work in a tavern, a groom in any noble's stable. Jesters possessed highly context-specific talents. Their humor relied on intimate knowledge of court personalities and politics. Their physical comedy was designed for specific performance spaces. Their entire identity was constructed around a particular patron's preferences. Without their court position, most jesters had few viable alternatives. Historical records occasionally mention former court jesters reduced to street performance or begging. Others disappeared entirely from recorded history, their fates unknown but likely grim. The awareness of this precarious future haunted jesters throughout their careers. Several historical accounts mention aging jesters attempting increasingly desperate performances to maintain their relevance, taking physical risks beyond their capabilities, or venturing into more dangerous political humor as they sensed their position weakening. Never truly off-duty, the performance that never ended. Another aspect of the jester's isolation was the near impossibility of ever stepping out of their role. Unlike other courtiers who could retreat to private chambers, remove official garments, and temporarily shed their public personas, jesters were expected to maintain their full identity virtually constantly. Historical accounts describe jesters being summoned at all hours, woken from sleep to entertain insomniac rulers, interrupted during meals to perform, expected to transform any casual encounter in a castle corridor into an amusing interlude. The boundaries between performance and existence blurred until the jester persona consumed the person beneath it. Court records from the Habsburg courts contain multiple references to jesters being housed near royal bedchambers, specifically so they could be summoned for middle-of-the-night entertainment. King Philip IV of Spain reportedly had a bell installed that connected directly to his jester's quarters, allowing him to summon entertainment at any hour without disturbing other servants. This constant performance requirement affected jesters physically and psychologically. Sleep deprivation appears frequently in historical accounts of court fools. A letter from a lady-in-waiting at the French court in 1572 mentions that the royal jester Chicot sleeps when he can, not when he should, for he must be ready always for his majesty's call. The psychological toll was perhaps even greater. Without the ability to periodically step out of their full persona, to simply exist as themselves, without performing, jesters experienced what modern psychologists might recognize as identity erosion. The artificial personality created for court entertainment gradually became inseparable from whatever authentic self had existed before. Some jesters developed complex coping mechanisms to create small pockets of authenticity within their performance-dominated lives. Historical accounts mention jesters who maintained private journals written in their own voice rather than their full persona. Others created distinct physical spaces, a private corner, a hidden chamber, even a particular window alcove, that they considered performance-free zones, though these respites were always subject to interruption. Particularly poignant are accounts of jesters who developed close relationships with animals, court dogs, cats, or birds. perhaps because these interactions allowed genuine emotional connection without performance expectations. Will Sommers, Henry VIII's jester, was reportedly deeply attached to a spaniel that accompanied him throughout the court. Unlike his human interactions, his relationship with the dog existed outside his performance requirements. This perpetual performance requirement made genuine human connections nearly impossible. How could a jester form authentic friendships when every interaction was potential material, every conversation a possible performance? The few documented close relationships between jesters and other court figures typically developed over many years and required extraordinary circumstances to overcome the performance barrier. The missing families, domestic life denied. The original text mentions that jesters had no family, which touches on another significant aspect of their isolation. While not universally true, historical records suggest that many court jesters were indeed denied normal family lives, either formally through employment restrictions or practically through their living arrangements and social status. Court employment records from various European courts reveal that many jesters were explicitly forbidden from marrying while in service. This restriction appears to have been motivated by several concerns: that family obligations might compete with court duties, that a jester with children might become more cautious and less entertaining, or simply that family connections might give the jester too much social integration and thus diminish their outsider status. Even when not explicitly forbidden, practical barriers often prevented jesters from forming families. Their unusual working hours, requirement to live at court, and social stigma made them unattractive marriage prospects. Women from respectable families would rarely consider marrying someone in such a marginalized profession, while match with someone of lower status might be blocked by the jester's court connection. Court accounts do record some exceptions to this pattern. Will Sommers apparently married and had at least one daughter, though records suggest his family lived away from court and he saw them only occasionally. The French jester Triboulet is believed to have married late in life after his most active court service. Jean de Verneuil, jester to Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy, received special permission to marry in 1355, with the Duke himself providing a small house for the couple, though the jester still had to live primarily at court. Female jesters faced even greater barriers to family life. Jane Foule and Mathurine de Valois appear to have remained unmarried throughout their lives, with no recorded children. Given the additional social constraints on women during the period, female jesters likely found it virtually impossible to combine their court role with any conventional family arrangement. For most jesters, the court itself became a substitute family, but an emotionally withholding one that offered institutional support without genuine intimacy. They occupied a strange position, simultaneously at the center of court life and fundamentally excluded from its human connections. This family denial had practical implications beyond the emotional impact. In an era before state pensions or retirement plans, family provided the primary safety net for aging individuals. Adult children were expected to care for elderly parents. Extended family networks offered support during illness or hardship. Without these connections, jesters faced old age with particular vulnerability. Perhaps most significantly, family connections provided social identity and legacy in medieval and Renaissance society. A person was understood partly through their lineage, their children, their place in an extended family network. Without these connections, jesters experienced a profound social invisibility that continued even after death. Death and lack of legacy, the disappearing fool. The poignant observation that when a jester died, no song was sung, no monument was built, highlights another aspect of their isolation. their remarkable absence from historical memorialization. Despite their proximity to power and their often decade-long service to history's most documented individuals, jesters typically disappeared from the record after death. Court financial accounts might note a final payment or a small funeral expense, but rarely much more. No tombs were built, no memorial masses endowed, no epitaphs composed, at least not for the vast majority. This absence reflects the jester's paradoxical position, central to court life yet fundamentally marginal to its official narrative. They were tools of entertainment and occasional counsel, but not people whose lives merited commemoration in the way nobles, clergy, or even respected servants might be remembered. Archival research reveals how thoroughly most jesters were erased after death. Of the dozens of named jesters who served at the English court from the 13th through 17th centuries, only a handful have identified burial places. Even famous jesters like Will Somers, whose likenesses were painted and whose jests were recorded in contemporary accounts, have no known grave markers or commemorative monuments. The situation was slightly better for jesters who managed to accumulate property during their lifetime. Chicot, the French royal jester who showed remarkable business acumen alongside his comedy, purchased land outside Paris and established a small charitable foundation that preserved his name locally for some time after his death. This was exceptional, however, and required financial resources beyond what most jesters could acquire. For the majority, death meant a swift transition from public figure to historical footnote, or often no footnote at all. Court records might simply note a payment for a new fool without even recording what happened to the previous one. This erasure extended beyond physical memorials to historical memory. While kings, queens, and prominent nobles had their deeds recorded by chroniclers, their characters analyzed in histories, and their words preserved in various documents, jesters typically survived only as anecdotes, brief stories illustrating particular jests or clever responses, without any sense of their full personalities or life experiences. The few exceptions to this pattern highlight its prevalence. When Triboulet died, King Francis I reportedly commissioned a small commemorative plaque, a gesture so unusual it was noted by contemporary writers as evidence of the king's exceptional affection for his jester. The very recording of this act as remarkable underscores how rarely jesters received even this modest remembrance. This lack of memorialization reflected a deeper reality about the jester's place in their society. They were valued for their function rather than their personhood. Once the function ended, the person behind it became largely irrelevant to the power structures they had served. Finding fragments, how we know what little we do. Given this systematic erasure, how do we know anything about historical jesters at all? The fragments of information we possess come from a variety of sources, each offering limited glimpses into these elusive lives. Court financial records provide the most consistent documentation. Payment entries for jesters appear in royal household accounts across Europe, offering basic information about names, periods of service, and occasionally specific performances or gifts. A 1532 entry in Henry VIII's household accounts, for instance, records payment for a coat of red and yellow for Will Somers, the king's fool, giving us both confirmation of his service and a hint about his costume. Diplomatic correspondence sometimes mentions jesters, particularly when they participated in significant court events or interacted with foreign visitors. Ambassadorial reports frequently noted the presence and sometimes the specific performances of court fools, especially if they seemed to influence the monarch or comment on diplomatic matters. A Venetian ambassador to England in 1527 wrote that The king's fool said much that was worth noting about the French alliance under cover of simplicity, suggesting both Somers' political awareness and his diplomatic significance. Personal journals and letters occasionally capture interactions with jesters. The diary of Philippe de Comin, a 15th century French diplomat, contains several references to Louis XVI's jester, describing both specific jokes and the king's reactions to them. These personal accounts provide our closest approximation of jesters' actual personalities and performance styles. Visual representations offer another fragmentary source. Court paintings occasionally include jesters, though usually in peripheral positions reflecting their social standing. Will Somers appears in a family portrait of Henry VIII standing at the edge of the composition, present but marginal, exactly as in life. A few jesters were painted in individual portraits, notably Somers and Chicot, but these are exceptional cases, usually reflecting particular royal favor. Literary works provide another window, though one that must be viewed cautiously. Collections of jests and witty sayings became popular in the 16th and 17th centuries, with some attributed to specific historical jesters. A Nest of Ninnies, 1608, includes jests allegedly from Skogan, while Will Somers' Whole Humor, 1637, purports to record the famous Tudor jester's wit. While these collections certainly capture period humor, historians debate how much they actually preserve the authentic words and personalities of the jesters they claim to document. Physical artifacts are extremely rare. Unlike kings and nobles who left behind jewelry, clothing, furniture, and weapons, jesters typically owned few valuable possessions. Occasionally, archaeological excavations at palace sites uncover small items potentially linked to court entertainers, bells, costume fragments, or performance props. But connecting these definitively to specific individuals is usually impossible. Through these fragmentary sources, we can assemble limited portraits of some jesters, but the picture remains frustratingly incomplete. We know what they were paid, sometimes what they wore, occasionally what they said, but rarely how they felt about their strange position or how they navigated its profound contradictions. The ultimate irony, forgotten truth-tellers. Perhaps the greatest irony of the jester's historical erasure is that these individuals, whose job centered on speaking truth that others dared not voice, have had so little opportunity to speak their own truth to history. They commented on kings' follies, nobles' hypocrisies, and courtiers' pretensions, yet their own perspectives on their lives remain largely unrecorded. They punctured the self-importance of the powerful, yet had few mechanisms to assert their own importance, even in historical memory. We know jesters primarily through the records of the very power structures they temporarily disrupted, filtered through the perspectives of the courts they served rather than through their own voices. Even our modern understanding of their role tends to romanticize and simplify a position that was doubtless more complex, contradictory, and difficult than surviving records suggest. The jester embodied a paradox, licensed to speak truth to power, yet ultimately powerless to speak their own truth to history, required to observe everything, yet themselves largely unobserved as full human beings, remembered for their function, forgotten as people. So yes, the feast was grand, the music was sweet, the jester jingled and joked and juggled through it all, and when the performance ended, whether through death, dismissal, or the simple ravages of age, they faded from the castle and from memory, leaving behind only scattered financial entries, occasional anecdotes, and perhaps a faded image at the edge of someone else's portrait. The loneliest seat at the feast wasn't just lonely in the moment. It was lonely through history, a position visible to every eye yet truly seen by almost none. And in that paradox lies perhaps the most profound truth about power and its relationship to honest speech. Those who speak uncomfortable truths to the powerful rarely get to write their own stories afterward. The jester made others immortal through their pointed observations, while remaining mortal and ultimately forgettable themselves. The bells fell silent, the motley faded, and history for the most part simply moved on, remembering the kings and forgetting their fools. So now as you lie there, hopefully drifting, maybe already half asleep, take a quiet moment to imagine it. The torchlit halls, the velvet tapestries, the clinking goblets, and somewhere in the middle, a figure in patchwork, eyes tired, smile practiced, juggling for the same people who wouldn't remember his name. Being a medieval court jester wasn't whimsical, it wasn't carefree. It was performance under pressure, comedy as camouflage, existence as entertainment. You weren't allowed to be sad, or quiet, or real. You were expected to dance through grief, joke through sickness, laugh through humiliation, and do it in bells, with style. And yet, there's something beautiful in it too, because the jester, for all his suffering, had power. Not the kind with armies or land, but the rarest kind, the power to speak truth when no one else could. He was laughed at, yes, but also listened to, mocked, but remembered in whispers, long after the feast ended. So, as you sink deeper into your pillow, safe and warm, take comfort in this. You don't have to perform for anyone right now. You're not being watched. You don't need to be clever, or brave, or amusing. You just get to rest. No bells, no mask, just you, your breath, and the soft, silent luxury of being forgotten in the very best way. Sleep well, friend. And if you made it this far, maybe leave a comment. Something like, still juggling. Barely. It helps me know you're out there. If you enjoyed this quiet little trip into the past, you can like, subscribe, or share it with a fellow tired time traveler. But only if you want to. No pressure. We're not in court anymore.